simply to get us back to the table, right? To get us back to what I would call the poker table. And that's a big amount of money to throw on the table, $7 billion, just to get Trump back there.
Carney's got some problems in paradise. Welcome back to Moose and Loose. My name's David. Today we've got Mark Carney's entire agenda, his entire plan imploding right in his own face. We're talking about CBAM, Carter border adjustment, his plan for Canada. Basing this on the UK, well, it's blowing up in the UK. What will Mr. Elbows Up do? We also have the media blasting Carney, saying how weak he is, how bad of a negotiator he is, saying that he is not getting a good deal for Canada. He's doing it all wrong. Let's jump into this. Starting this one off from the Financial Times, says EU to exempt heavy industry from carbon tax exports. So as Table Salt points out, there goes Carney's tax revenue. The Liberals' entire worldview is collapsing. No way he can saddle steel and aluminum with a carbon tax now. That's just the truth of it. Mark Carney mentioning so many times how we have to be competitive on the world stage, and that involves green steel and green this and that, putting a carbon tax, a CBAM, this carbon border adjustment on Canada to be competitive. Well, the EU now exempting carbon tax from heavy industry. This will just hurt Brookfield's profits. Thank Trump, hate or not, he knows the green agenda is a scam. Isn't that the truth? This is popping up on numerous headlines. This one from Mark Nixon. EU lawmakers agreed to exempt 90% of companies from the CBAM import carbon tax. So the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism they have in the UK, something that Mark Carney wants to bring to Canada. Well, they're pulling back on this in the EU. Concessions to support European producers in the face of foreign competition follow calls to ease climate targets. Says here, the European Commission will propose on Wednesday that sectors such as steel, cement, aluminum should be exempt from paying for the carbon emissions for their exports to level the playing field for foreign competitors, according to two EU officials involved in the talks. The proposal comes amid heated debate over the ability of the EU to meet its climate targets against the backdrop of global trade war and rapid shift of priorities towards defense and economic competitiveness. So they're doing that big rebuild Europe thing, and they're saying, hey, we can't be competitive and do this climate nonsense.
As our businesses, as our big industry decarbonize, we don't want foreign steel coming here that's high carbon, right? From Asia, from America. So we will have a carbon border adjustment mechanism that prevents that from happening and puts them in a stronger position.
The EU Climate Commissioner Wopke Hoekstra told the Financial Times that the EU had to double down on making the conditions for meeting the targets better for business. Also said at the expense of our own companies, and they face unfair competition on the global market. In a further compromise, Brussels said 3% of the 2040 target, this is their climate targets, may be met by international carbon credits, essentially a way for member states to count their financing of international climate projects towards their own emissions savings. So this carbon credits that they're talking about, once again, it's all linked back to Brookfield. Brookfield, one of the biggest suppliers of carbon credits. Here's all the different carbon credits. You know, Mark Carney originally brought this in as special envoy on climate finance at the UN. And Brookfield has all these different companies that produce carbon credits. There's a bunch of them in here. Going back here, making sure companies are CBAM compliant, which is forcing them to have emission standards that essentially, as this article is pointing out, doesn't make them competitive. They're not going to be competitive with China, with India, with any other country. And they're realizing that it's destroying their country. As it mentions here, the CBAM tax on emissions produced by imports into the bloc to protect EU industry from being undercut by cheaper, dirtier imports.
We have this carbon market that's in place, and we have an opportunity so that the large polluters, on the marginal reductions that they make, that they can pay for people's climate smart choices. It will end up being a more efficient market for them. The government will stand in the middle and make sure that people have clear incentives, and if we are elected.
The EU cement industry has estimated that if the carbon prices rises to about 125 euros by 2030, the price could account for more than 50% of the production costs. So if they produce, say, $1,000 of cement, well, half of that cost is simply carbon costs, this nonsense costs. And if you have other countries like India, they'd be able to produce it at that $1,000 minus the 50% the carbon cost, so $500. They'd probably produce it cheaper than that, like $400. So how do you compete when you're charging $1,000 when you can buy it in India, say, for $400? This is a fictitious example, but you get the idea.
That's the future of trade. The future of trade is digital. The future of trade does take carbon into account. Carbon is trade. The future of trade does have this defense cooperation. It is consistent with industrial policy, recognizing that industrial policy amongst allies. We're all going to NATO, but only some of us in NATO are talking about an allied industrial policy that will make us stronger. That's the future of trade, not a narrow discussion on tariffs.
Putting these markets at risk in an already weak market is not a very smart thing to do. It seems the EU is starting to wake up, and this just completely blows out Mark Carney's entire plan for Canada and, well, Brookfield and his shares in Brookfield, that whole money-making scheme. He can't force Canada towards this EU plan when EU is backing away from their own plan. He was using this as the catalyst to speed up this transition. Well, he can't do that anymore. This essentially just nukes his entire plan. 1,200 German companies filed bankruptcy in the last 6 months alone. EU has been deindustrialized for its Ukraine project. Its sanctions have clearly backfired on them. They were competitive for only one reason. They sucked up cheap Russian fuel since WW2. They still buy them, but over 4 times the price via Turkstream. So that's a pipeline that goes through there. Someone should really do a wellness check on Carney. Yeah, his entire plan just got thrown out the window. Mark Carney getting hit on all fronts. On CTV here, we've got Scott Reed trying to prop him up a little bit here, talking about the DST and taking that big loss.
Realistic or not, what do you think?
Well, hard to say, but they put themselves in a position of maximum pressure because if you think about it, when they did move on the DST, they would have been able to rewrite the deadline at that same moment. They chose not to. In fact, it seems that the government's strategy is to use the DST removal, the removal of the digital services tax, to actually intensify talks. Say, all right, so we are taking this off the table. And in exchange, we want to make certain that we drive toward that deadline, that we do get that.
Oh, please. They had to remove that tax because there was a massive backlash coming. But it seems like the plan the entire time. Mark Carney doesn't want to rock the boat with all those big tech companies that are highly invested in Brookfield. But Mark Carney trying to make a deal by dragging this out to the last minute. He wasn't doing this as a strategy to squeeze Donald Trump. He got squeezed by Trump.
That deal. The White House is very hard to read. Do they want a deal or not? They concluded a deal with China. They concluded today a deal with Vietnam. But, you know, the president keeps talking about sticking points like supply management. Obviously, he's going after our auto sector. So we'll see. It's looming. Only 19 days and counting.
The digital services tax being eliminated. What do you make of that move?
Well, I think, frankly, first of all, we had little choice. I don't think we had much of an option other than to withdraw it. If we didn't, then talks were going to cease. And at that point, then we're left with not only the possibility that the tariffs that are in place won't be removed, but that on July 9th, remember that's a date that Donald Trump has circled on his calendar, he's going to impose a raft of new tariffs that we would be included in that. So we might have the prospect of tariffs against things that are today not tariff. So I think we had to basically back down. And I think they're trying to make the most of it that they will. Knowing that he disliked that tax, they remove it and then try to use it to intensify talks and make certain that the Americans are focused. As much as anything, you hear that, you know, the Americans are indifferent. And so maybe this deadline will focus the mind and drive them toward some kind of conclusion by that time.
You know, we talked a little bit earlier about a 23% drop, Scott, in Canadian car exports in the month of April. And so, you know, you look at numbers like that, which is huge. The talks going on today between the Prime Minister and top auto executives at Ford and GM, others. And what's the takeaway here? It seems like, you know, the Americans are in the power position again.
They are. And, you know, this is an existential threat to Canada's auto sector. And there is no such thing as Canada's auto sector, of course. It is an integrated North American auto sector.
Yeah, it's integrated. Mark Carney coming out saying it's over, though. A relationship is over, was a dumb bonehead move. We all know that behind the scenes he was telling Trump, don't worry, I'm just lying to Canadians to try to win the election. I'm not actually against you, blah, 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 all that. You know, smoothing it over with Trump. But Americans hearing that message don't like that message, not spending money in America anymore. Multiple sectors getting hit, including the auto industry. As you just saw, we have industry leaders telling Mark Carney he's out to lunch with the EV mandate. There's a lot of things that need to give here. The Liberals are out of control.
But Donald Trump is looking to end that. I don't know that he can actually reimagine the auto sector into something that's wholly placed in the United States, but he can sure as heck create massive havoc and upheaval, as we're seeing only now. And here's one of the big things that this takes me to. It almost illuminates the big question around July 21st, which is, well, what kind of deal are we talking about? I mean, Donald Trump seems so intent on destroying Canada's ability to make cars. That seems to be such a sine qua non. Can we even get around that? What kind of auto manufacturing in Canada will he continue to tolerate? What's success look like? And so that to me is, as much as anything, the auto sector, its future, and how we can possibly wring out any concessions on Donald Trump remains one of the biggest, most difficult questions to mend.
Good to see you, my friend, and happy.
There's a lot of sectors getting hammered here. The auto industry, one of them. This first comment's funny. Reid is upset he can't blame Poilievre. Isn't that the truth? Scott Reid is a partisan lunatic. How about take off all the tax and have free trade? Yep. What we're seeing is Donald Trump fighting for America and Mark Carney not fighting for Canada. We don't have someone in our corner. Voters voted for Mark Carney thinking he would fight for Canada. He is not fighting. He's not doing anything. If he was really serious about this is Mr. Crisis saying we're in a crisis and he's good in a crisis, then he would be sitting Parliament through the summer. I mean, just think about this for a second here. Mark Carney can't even deal with the supply management situation if that's a major concession that he has to give up, because that would require legislation to get rid of it, because they put it into law just before the negotiations. What a bonehead move. He's not really serious about negotiating with Trump, otherwise he wouldn't have tried to lock these things into law. So if Donald Trump says get rid of that supply management, he has to recall Parliament and get people in there to vote on it and get rid of that law. And that deal might disappear then. It's not going to be something quick you can just sign with a pen and be done with it. So Mark Carney has already tied his hands behind his back before even going to negotiate. This is not a serious leader. Mark Carney is not a serious leader of this country. And moving over to this one, we've got a trade expert saying that Carney's paying an extremely high price to just restart the U.S. trade talks.
Bring in some more insights to this conversation. We have with us Stuart True, international trade policy researcher, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Good afternoon, and thank you for your time, Stuart. Your perspective on how all of this has played out, with the Prime Minister confirming that in the larger scheme of things, we were already expecting something like that to come. That's what he said in Ottawa about 25 minutes ago.
Yeah, that was quite interesting, I thought, just coming out and explaining exactly what the strategy was. They were planning on getting rid of this tax altogether all along. I think it's something trade watchers have been thinking about for a while and seeing for a while. We just expected that capitulation would come down in the context of a renegotiation or review of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. But here we have it simply to get us back to the table, right? To get us back to what I would call the poker table. And that's a big amount of money to throw on the table, $7 billion, just to get Trump back there. When we know that these negotiations are not going well, from what we can see. It's not even entirely clear that we're going to get a deal where there's no more tariffs, right?
Yeah, that is not the truth. We don't even know. Mark Carney did not seem confident at all when he was asked about it, about getting a deal. He's like, oh, we're working to get the best deal, but maybe we don't get a deal. The fact that they're coming out now and saying, yeah, it was the plan the entire time to get rid of the DST. Yeah. Trying to save face here as Mark Carney's getting a real dose of what is to negotiate against the guy who wrote the book on it and who's in control of the most powerful market in the world. Mark Carney's outclassed here. He can't go toe-to-toe with Trump, not even close.
This is something that's being floated by the government in conversations with the business sector in Canada. And so it does seem like an extremely high price to pay just to get back to this table without any certainty that a deal is coming or that it's going to be a particularly appetizing deal for Canada.
So, Stuart, if I were to draw something with what you're saying that there may be a deal or may not. We'll see July 21st. But tariffs is something you believe will stay. Now, the question really is the percentage of the tariffs and on what kind of goods will the tariff stay. Is that what you're saying?
That's my assumption. It's based on the deal we've seen coming out of the UK and some of these other deals, negotiations Trump has going on with other countries. It's really becoming, I think, apparent that the negotiations are to lower the tariffs or to kind of come to some kind of temporary status, right? Stability with respect to trade. But Trump has no intention of removing these tariffs. He says he's a tariff guy. He likes tariffs. So it's possible Canada can reduce them when the Carney government's objective, as they've stated, is to remove them. So, to me, part of the difficulty of these talks is going to be to square that circle, is where do we end up? Now, if we got rid of the digital services tax for zero tariffs, that might be something to be, cautiously optimistic about, but we simply don't know. And I think it's unlikely when you look at what the UK was able to negotiate recently with the Trump administration.
Yeah, but the catch here is the kind of trade that US does with UK is very different from the volume and the kind of trade US does with Canada. My next question to you is, in terms of making these negotiations and bargaining, what else do you think Canada has or might have to lose to get a significant a beneficial trade deal for Canada?
I have no idea, actually. I mean, what else do we have to give is one question I have. We've seen already since December, we've spent billions more on border security. We're proposing to spend tens of billions of dollars on this Golden Dome project, right? This unworkable missile defense project. We're passing the border security measures in Bill C-2. We're making it easier for the United States to invest in, critical mineral projects here through C-5. We're giving quite a bit, and I've seen no evidence that it's had any effect, right, on the negotiations so far. So I'm a little worried about that question you asked, is what else do we have to give? And
well, supply management is the obvious one because Donald Trump mentioned it. You don't have to look far. You just have to look on his tweets. He said the border, getting rid of the street fennel. Canada is not a trusted nation right now because we're so well integrated with China. That's our leadership, being the Liberals, Justin Trudeau, Mark Carney, they're all wrapped in with China. Obviously, he mentioned the DST, got rid of that. He mentioned the dairy cartel, supply management. But what does Mark Carney do? He puts it in law that the supply management can't be touched. This is a way to piss off Trump. This is not a way to negotiate. Is Mark Carney seriously negotiating for Canada, or is he trying to get the worst deal possible?
And for what kind of deal? I mean, really kind of going back to some kind of pre-chaos status quo would be pretty good at this point, right?
Yeah.
But we're beyond that. We're already made several concessions to the United States. We're cooperating at every step. And so I'm quite worried about what else we're going to have to give up next. But we have no idea. These negotiations, as Mr. Axworthy was saying, have been very secretive. And the government is telling us that has to be the case. We can't negotiate in public, but we really have no idea what Canada is prepared to do. Or what the Trump administration is ultimately asking at this point, or whether we're going to have to do this all over again in the context of a review of the Canada-US-Mexico agreement come October or November.
Yeah, very complex situation.
It is complex. We know they want our critical minerals. They don't have enough themselves. We know they want our oil. They're already getting at a discount. Not to mention all those other pieces. Clearly, we can make a deal with them if we had someone who knew what they were doing at the table. That's not Mark Carney. It's funny, if you look at CBC here on the side, this title says, U.S. Ambassador claims Carney sees 51st state talk as a term of endearment. This is how CBC is framing that 51st state talk. Endearment. That's a joke. Donald Trump's just using that to rock the boat again, as he always does. It's just funny how CBC has to spin that as a positive for Carney. And America sees that. They see that the media lies. The media isn't honest. The Americans and Donald Trump and his team want to deal with a team that is an honest group of people to deal with. They know they're dealing with a bunch of scoundrels right now in the Liberals. Canada made a huge mistake re-electing this Liberal bunch. Yep. Carney's way out of his depth here. He thinks more taxes will help Canadians. Carney folded faster than Superman on Laundry Day.